Good day, mates. My name is Mordecai, and welcome back to the show, where an inexperienced role-player narrates various RPG-related stories as a learning tool. And today's narration is going to cover an entire saga, end to end. Since this is on the longer side of the narration spectrum, I will provide timestamps for each of the parts in the description, as well as listed here on the slide. So if you want to take a break and return later, you can pick up where you left off more easily. Something I admit looking forward to, being a new player for tabletop role-playing games, is being able to play in long campaigns consisting of many story arcs. And there are a number of aspects that can keep such long campaigns interesting for the party, having interplay of in-character rivalries, intriguing world building, usage of politics to rally towns and cities against a common threat, and so on. Sometimes, however, individual players and even groups of players can have their experience upset by a problem player, or even a problematic DM, with a skewed approach to running the game. Today's story is an entire saga, a big, multi-post story featuring the exploits of the party. This saga is primarily about the exploits of Karl, the problem player, and Melvin, the problem DM. So what do these exploits involve? Let's find out. Before we get started with the narration, if you like my content and want to see more of it, be sure to subscribe and like the video. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Enjoy! Let's hop into the often terrifying world of r/RPGHorrorStories. Today's story is posted across a total of 3 posts, all written by Jack of Many Names. The first part of the Karl and Melvin saga is titled, Getting Assassinated by Another Player on the Night of My Exam Out of Game. Note, names of people have been changed. Characters are not named and instead use player names. Events have stayed the same. Note 2. I myself am partially to blame for some of what occurs in-game, reaping what I had sown, but otherwise does not excuse the actions of the other players. A bit of background. A few years back, when I was still at university, the RPG group I was a part of had ended our year-long game, and were moving on to our next campaign. Our GM decided that this time around, we'd be doing a kingdom-based game in Pathfinder 1st Edition, but with a twist. The idea was that there would be 2 groups. The first group, us, would be hired by a kingdom to venture through a portal into a new world and set up a kingdom there. Furthermore, setting up ourselves as the ruling body so long as we maintained good relationships with the kingdom that funded our expedition. The second group, whom would be formed much later, would be street rats living under our rule, trying their best to destabilize and eventually overthrow us, with sessions from that point onward being played back to back by both groups, letting the effects of one affect the other. Furthermore, the GM gave us the opportunity to create some custom races for the game, but also made note that this would be a high risk of character death, as encounters would be hard. Liking the idea and not fearing the high brutality, I joined this game, as did the rest of the group, and a few others. Having played with them a year, I got a good grip on what to expect, namely something on the more chaotic side. But hoped things wouldn't have repeats of situations involving certain key players and their actions tending towards total party wipeouts. Throughout the game there were a good many players, but for this particular part, here are the relevant ones. Myself, a human investigator, Eric, a Wyvern paladin, the Pathfinder equivalent to a dragonborn, Karl, a gnome alchemist, Tim, a wasp man fighter, a custom race for the new world, Sam, a pixie dragon sorcerer, custom race from the old world, Ik, a human wizard, and Guy, a human swashbuckler. Introductions begin, with the campaign having a solid start. We entered through a portal into a large camp within the new world, and went about with our introductions, some of us taking great note of the Wasp Man and wondering as to what else may be lying in wait for all of us. We eventually meet up with the camp's head leader, an NPC who we'll call Dandemir. Midway through conversing with Dandemir, both Sam and Rick begin to converse about the nature of magic. Being part alchemist, investigators are a hybrid class of rogue and alchemist, I join in on the conversation. The roleplay going on was quite enjoyable, a debate brewing on just what magic was between scholars of both magic and science. Alas, it was interrupted by our Karl. To speak of his alchemist, he went with the gun chemist archetype, which allows the alchemist not only the means to use guns, but to be able to shoot alchemical bombs from them. Karl also happened to be a chaotic min-maxer that has, in the past, gotten our group into more trouble than not. Karl's interruption wouldn't have been so bad either, if it wasn't packed with an insult slurred at our characters. Wanting the roleplay to continue a bit longer, I decide to say, midway through their speech, Karl, shh, you're interrupting. Now Rick, as you were saying? There was a pause, followed by laughter at the table, followed by panic as Karl turned to the GM and said, I take my gun out, load an explosive round, and fire it into the tent. And by that he meant he got onto his pet Diabat, loaded up on double buckshot that he had mounted to it, and then opened fire. As a small reminder, we were having this conversation, standing right next to the guy funding this whole operation, as well as the one who hired us to begin with. We made the save to get out of the way as the explosion went off, none of us getting too injured, thankfully. But all the same, not exactly putting us in the right mindset for working with this gnome. In any case, Dandemir had gotten out of harm's way and didn't think too much of this whole experience. We eventually went out exploring, finding dune worms in a small desert biome with a giant tree in the middle. We had climbed it and settled down for the night. Knowing that we had gotten off on the wrong foot, speaking in Gnomish, I tried to talk to Karl's gnome about our wasp man friend and how it'd be interesting to dissect one of his species. You know, curiosity and science being things that my character was known for, with the added vice of obsession with knowledge. Karl merely nodded and that ended the night. To skip forward a bit, our major obstacle in this world turned out to be the local inhabitants of monster tribes. Gnolls, ogres, giants, and the like, all led by a shaman who could summon demons from the abyss. A brief encounter with some demons led us to know that we needed some serious leveling, or some good loot before we could tackle this rather serious problem. Thus leading us to the city. The city. Scouts from the camp had found a large structure to the north of the camp. Gathering our supplies, we ventured forth under the cover of night to slide right by the roaming Gnoll tribes. We found a large, expansive city, long since abandoned, and, as it turns out, teeming with loot. Our party split up to cover even more ground. Tim and Karl went off together, and then immediately found something that caused the GM to pull them into another room to speak with them in private. Immediately, I started having Nam flashbacks to the previous campaign I was in, because I knew, if anything, this would end badly. The Nam-style flashbacks only worsened when they came back, Tim with a strange end, his wasp man all frigidy, and Karl carrying a longsword, wearing a strange amulet. The few times Karl got his hands on any kind of amulet, it nearly total party wiped out the party on account of them being cursed, or containing archdevils or greater demons that he was more than happy to help escape. Alas, in character, there was nothing I could do to find out if it was as bad as I thought it was. Nor would I think it suspicious given that we had all just gotten some loot, myself finding a +1 shocking greatsword. That session ended with our characters settling into an abandoned 2-story building for the night. The game then got put on hold as exams were starting up and wouldn't be over for at least 2 weeks. As such, I got stuck into the books, and did my best to stay off of all social media. I failed at the staying off the social media part, but I still studied nonetheless, as were units I had to pass that, bluntly put, I hated and wanted to be done with. I didn't want to do it, but they were integral for my degree, so I had to deal with it. The assassination. A week into the exam period, and I had done some exams, studying like a madman for my last one. The exam was on a Monday morning, and it was a Sunday night. I was making notes, going over those last bits of info I think might be relevant, when I decided to take a small break and check out Discord. I see, scrolling through the servers, that the GM was in a voice call with Tim and Karl. From the looks of it, they were playing Dota or something, so I didn't think too much of it. Moments before I was about to close Discord down, I got a message from the GM. Hey, could you roll a fortitude save? Weird thing to ask, but I did so. I rolled a natural 20. A few minutes later, on the Discord for the game, I start to see the DM roll the dice bot a lot. I get a message a few minutes later. Yeah, your character had a good run. I paused for a moment, then asked what they meant. Turns out, something had come in and assassinated them in the night. Last I recalled from the session, we had only just settled into the building, not even deciding who was on watch. The GM apparently decided that Sam would be on watch, with everyone else being asleep, which was weird considering their perception was amongst the lowest the party had access to. It didn't take much to figure out who did it, and I didn't exactly think straight when I jumped into the call with the other three and started pointing the finger. Tim and Karl both played oblivious the whole time, not even breaking when I told them that I had an exam the next day I was stressing over and that character assassination didn't help with that. The next day I did the exam. Fortunately, I did well enough to pass the unit, but only just, and I didn't have to suffer through that whole ordeal again. However, now that that was over with, certain individuals came clean about the situation. It turns out, both Karl and Tim plotted my character's murder. Karl using the conversation about dissecting a wasp man to convince Tim, who had turned chaotic evil by this point, to eat my remains after he snuck into my tent and coup de grace me with a magic shape-shifting longsword. It also turns out that the sword and amulet weren't just magic, but also sentient, looking for a wielder to act as a vigilante, but the only way that Karl's gnome would agree and be turned lawful good was to kill my character. The reasoning for killing my investigator was that they felt he was annoying and insulting to deal with, and as an investigator, I would eventually figure out what his sword and amulet were. In truth, and I told Karl as much, I wasn't mad that he did what he did, but I was mad that he did it during exams and out of game. The explanation of he was bored didn't help much either. Alas, I got over it. Our swashbuckler wasn't as lucky, however, because come session time, the wasp man got found out with my body, and when Eric used Detect Evil, the little red beeper that went evil went off like a bat. The wasp man then immediately went after the nearest player, which was Guy, and then one-rounded him to death. Tim didn't last so long either, having everyone in the party go open season on him, resulting in not only one, not two, but a total of 3 player deaths. And all the while, the gnome was getting away with murder. In conclusion, whilst I hold nothing against the player or their character for this character murder, sadly in this campaign it would not be the last, nor would they be the only one gunning it for me. Let me know if you want to hear more, cause I got plenty to tell. In summary, the investigator annoys the alchemist just a little. The alchemist gets a cool sword and assassinates them in their sleep outside of the game over Discord during an exam period. And that's the end of part 1 of this saga. Now, I am no stranger to the concept of party conflict, But there's something unsettling about having the other players in the party conspire to kill off another player character, especially considering that this has the potential to upset the player of said character post-mortem. The assassination of said character was also conducted without the player's consent, knowledge, or involvement as well, which makes the situation much worse. It's also worth noting that the DM had our poster roll a fortitude save, in which he scored a natural 20, but then ended up dying anyway. What is the point, exactly, in having a player roll a saving throw if the required save is impossible for the player? To preserve the illusion of choice? Yeah, I don't exactly know either. What I do know is that this was merely part 1 of this entire saga, and that Karl is definitely something of a problem player. And no, I'm not just referring to his tendency to play purely optimized characters through the process of min-maxing. There's also a deal of main character syndrome and spotlight hogging as well. Creating conflict in the party simply because you are bored is never a great idea unless you get the consent of the DM and the other players at the table. The second part of the saga is titled, Paladin tries to use a chaos-hating Hell Knight to get me killed again, and picks up shortly after part 1 concluded. Note, names of people have been changed, characters are not named and use player names. Events have stayed the same. Furthermore, I hold no ill will towards people that did what they did in these posts. This, however, does not excuse their actions. A reminder of players and their characters as well as new players. Myself, a human investigator, Eric, a Wyvern paladin, the Pathfinder equivalent to a Dragonborn, Karl, a gnome alchemist, Tim, dead, and then an elf cleric, coming from the New World. Sam, a pixie dragon sorcerer, a custom race from the Old World, Rick, a human wizard, Amanda, a kitsune monk, a kitsune is a fox person for reference, and Eugene, the half-giant Hell Knight. And because I've yet to give a name for the GM, let's just call him Melvin. A bit of between-story background and filler. When last I left off on this game, I had gotten assassinated outside of game over Discord during the exam period. Tim tried to get rid of the body only for the paladin to see a dead body and detected evil on the wasp man. Guy's swashbuckler gets one-rounded by Tim, and then promptly gets murked by the whole party. Suffice to say, things have happened. Due in part to scheduling conflicts and other reasons I cannot remember or were not said, it's been a few years, Guy stopped coming to the games. The session he got killed, he rolled up a Dwarven Barbarian, but you'll see what happens to that in a bit. That same session where both Guy and Tim died, we also had 2 other players join the game. Amanda, the GM's girlfriend, and Eugene, a friend of Melvin. I've played in games with Amanda before, so I knew there wasn't going to be much trouble so long as they didn't get their hands on yet another cursed weapon. The last time they got one of those, they went on a murder spree and... oh gosh, I am not reading that out. But it is bad. It's unapologetically bad. Eugene, on the other hand, no joke, that dude was a bit concerning. Mostly as the pre-session conversation and first meeting the guy, he detailed out his love for medieval torture and how he would at times in the game try to enact some of those on people of suspicious natures within our kingdom to try and weed out information. To say I was more than a little perturbed was an understatement, but I figured that if they did try that, then more than just myself would step in to say no. We'll get there, give it a bit. Amanda brought with him a kitsune monk who from later interactions was friendly enough and not what they usually played. Eugene decided to bring a half-giant Hell Knight of the Order of the Rack. For those playing the home game, a Hell Knight is to chaos what a paladin is to evil. They are ruthlessly devout to order and law, so much so that they think their lords supersede all others. They do not care for good, evil, or exceptions, only that law prevails, and all those that are chaotic are purged from the world. Those of the Order of the Rack are especially nasty, comparable to the secret police in their need to crush free thought, and the writings of creatives and inventors. This then leaves the question of what I would be playing, since my investigator died. Well, I decided that instead of playing a new character, I would put my foot down and ask the party to resurrect me the first chance they got. In the meantime, I had a mount I brought over from the old world that my character was from, which was a pterodon. To skip ahead a bit, turns out the city at night had a lot of roaming undead, and a few homebrewed GM creations that were very on-brand for Melvin, in that it was big, could kill us very quickly, and took a good many high rolls to hit and damage. Suffice to say, Tim's mentor, a vampire lord of a neighbouring kingdom, showed up and raised me from the dead. Now, with that out the way, we return once more to my would-be assassin, Karl. Karl has a change of alignment. Upon my return from the land of the dead, Karl immediately spins a tale of how Tim's wasp man went evil and was likely trying to eat me, or take the body back to the Hive Queen of the Wasp people. Out of character, I didn't hold much against them for the assassination, only that they could have picked a better time to do so. All the same, in the immediate moment in character, I brushed my own death aside as no biggie and asked about the body of the dead Wasp man. A bit of investigating and dissecting later, I found that the body had mutated, forming strange tumours within. Karl, being an alchemist, wanted to examine them and do some experimenting. As a show of good faith and to try to make them think all was well, I asked that Karl's gnome hold on to them for safekeeping, as long as they shared their findings. A short while later, I asked both Rick and Sam about my murder and roll some dice to put two and two together. Investigators, for the record, are good at skill rolls. Given the information, it wasn't hard to put together who the assassin was, the murder weapon, the motive, and collaborator, all whilst in character. To try and surmise the main in-character points, there were only so many people in the party that had tried to kill me, had a bladed weapon capable of thrusting narrow holes, could sneak by the entire party, had access to magics needed to pull any of this off, and whom had gone off with the Wasp Man right before they went all twitchy. But that didn't matter much, because as I was having this revelation, the gnome left on their diabat, flying away into the sunset, and far away. As it turned out, Karl was switching out of this character for a Dampier Paladin, and even more odd than that, he was a Chosen One Paladin of the New World's deity, called the Fluffy Unicorn. Karl's reasoning for this was that he wanted to prove that he could play a lawful good character, but I somewhat suspect it may also have been because my investigator came back and would probably confront them about the murder sooner or later. In character, and in truth, there was only one thing I was really mad about. That gnome took the gosh darn Waspman tumors with him. In any case, now that he was a paladin and more or less had to try to be a good person in-game, Pathfinder paladins have to be lawful good and uphold the tenets of their deity, or they straight up lose their paladin powers. They don't get a new archetype that still gives them smite and magic, they straight up have to work to get back what they lost. So, what's the worst that they could do? Eugene's public announcement service. Skipping ahead a bit, we had done some raids on the Knoll tribes, whittling away until there was only a few camps left. All the while, Eugene was casting Detect Chaos left and right in every enemy in sight. This wound up being a problem for me, as with the leaving of the gnome, my investigator was the only member of the party with a chaotic alignment. Thus, foreseeing this being a potential problem, I worked alongside both Sam and Rick to import some scrolls from the Kingdom funding our expedition to fill out our spellbooks. One such spell was Undetectable Alignment, which became a mandatory spell I cast daily. Out of character, it wasn't much of a secret what alignment everyone was, as our sheets were out in the open for all of us to see. But thanks to my spell, even in moments when I was close to the detection, Eugene didn't get any pings of chaos. Whilst I knew that I was at least somewhat protected, the people in our camp were not. Returning from a successful raid on a camp of ogres, Eugene starts to prowl around the camp with his Detect Chaos going, when he happens upon a guard and immediately starts to interrogate them. The conversation went something akin to this. Have you committed any crimes? Nope. Have you killed anyone? Well, yes, because... Grabs face and immediately knocks them out, dragging the body towards their tent, which we found out was filled with torture devices. Seeing this occur, Eric steps forth and intervenes. Most of the party is not having any of what Eugene was doing, but doing so in character and heatedly debating whether or not they had broken any laws. Things escalate, weapons are drawn, when Dandemir comes out and asks what that commotion was all about. A bit of back and forth then has the party waking up the guard and having them explain themselves, to which they state, "Yeah, I've killed people because I'm a guard. I've shot down thieves stealing from our lord." Having said this, and it now being clear Eugene was in the wrong, he goes into his tent and tortures himself for this wrongdoing, as if it was a part of his Hell Knight code. The weird thing, however, was that Karl's paladin was siding with Eugene on the grounds of it being a lawful act. Technically, by Hell Knight law, they had the authority to do this, and it wasn't an unlawful act to try and seek truth and justice through any means necessary, and that it was a good act to root out those that cannot be trusted. Karl, after this incident, went to my investigator to get my opinion on the situation. My response was as such. There is nothing wrong with law, however any virtue in excess becomes a vice. Too much law can result in lawlessness, and thus becomes meaningless. I thought it was them trying to get some role-playing in, broaden the horizons and whatnot. Turns out, this gave them the excuse that they were looking for. How not to play a paladin? Over the next week, I got a message from Karl that he wanted to chat in character in direct messages. This wasn't uncommon for our group and was above board so long as Melvin was present. The following conversation with them can be best summed up as such. You are hiding your alignment of chaos from the Hell Knight. Come with me and confess your crimes to him, and maybe you'll be redeemed. Or I shall tell him you are guilty of this crime myself, and then aid him in your capture and confession. In other words, go ahead and maybe most probably die, or die and I'll help them kill you. It didn't seem to matter much of what I said in the conversation in character, as it was pretty clear from the tone what their intention was. I decided that the only logical move was to say, sure, I'll go with them, but I had a few things to take care of first. They then agreed, and the moment they left, I messaged every other player I could trust in the group, got them into a group chat in character, and told them the situation. My immediate thought was, hey, they have to follow the law, right? So, since we'll be the ruling body of these lands, why not try to change them immediately to not allow Hell Knights free reign? Unfortunately, that wasn't going to work for a number of reasons. Sure, we opt for the more civilized approach. If Eugene and Karl tried anything, the rest of us, except for Tim who had left the call, not wanting to help for character reasons, agreed to be on standby to help out if PvP was unavoidable. A few hours later, I get another in-character message from Karl. It was time to go see the Hell Knight, when Karl's paladin suddenly apologizes out of the blue for their rudeness and asks for forgiveness. I had to pause reading that message when it arrived, because I didn't know what to make of it. I gave my forgiveness nonetheless and later drove to the session at Sam's place. When I arrived, Amanda broke it to me on what had happened. As it turns out, the fluffy unicorn only has a few tenets you had to follow. Be kind to everyone, and do not make people unhappy, both of which he had broken religiously. Furthermore, I was told that Melvin had to hop in a voice call with Karl, told them off for acting out of alignment, and then had to teach them how to play lawful good. Hence the apology and the asking for forgiveness. The conclusion. Eugene wasn't able to make that session, and I had a decently fun time. We at that point only had one more camp to go, and it would be the last one. A few boss battles were promised, and then we would be in the clear to set up our kingdom at long last. And hey, Karl seemed like he was learning how to be lawful good, even if only a little bit. I kinda figured maybe this would turn out alright after all. Unfortunately, hindsight is 2020, and the gnome wasn't done killing us just yet. To be continued in part 3. In summary, a paladin tries to use a chaos-hating, torture-loving Hell Knight to kill me again, then has to get taught by the GM how to play lawful good. And that's the end of part 2 of this saga. Well, the first thing I can say is that I'm glad the DM stepped up and told Karl off for not adhering to the principles of the character he was role-playing as. Now, as much as I am fond of having characters in the party that do not get 100% along with each other, there's a distinct difference between having a slight disagreement and blatantly displaying hostility towards your fellow party members because you don't like the other player for some reason. There's something especially egregious about trying to manipulate another player into doing really dirty work in the form of killing your fellow party member. It should also be said that hindsight is often considered to have 20/20 vision, although in my experience prior to learning about playing tabletop role-playing games, it's more like 50/50 vision. Hindsight has a tendency to notice details, but go unnoticed by even those with 20/20 vision. More on that later. It is pretty clear to me that Karl is a metagamer as well as a chaotic min-maxer. After all, as far as I can tell, the paladin Karl was playing never made any form of knowledge check about what these Hell Knights do in character, instead relying on the metaverse-breaking technique of using player knowledge to do so. I guess my biggest question at this point is, why is Karl actively trying to screw over his fellow party members? The third part of this saga is titled Return of the Gnome, and features the return of the chaotic gnome whom started the entire saga. Note, names of people have been changed. Characters are not named and instead use player names. Events have stayed the same. Furthermore, I hold no ill will towards people that did what they did in these posts. This, however, does not excuse their actions. A reminder of players and their characters. Myself, a human investigator. Eric, a Wyvaran paladin, the Pathfinder equivalent to a Dragonborn. Karl, a Dhampir Chosen One paladin of the Fluffy Unicorn / Gnome Alchemist. Tim, an Elf Cleric. Sam, a Pixie Dragon Sorcerer. Rick, a Human Wizard. Amanda, a Kitsune Bonk, a Kitsune as a fox person for reference. Eugene, the half-giant Hell Knight of the Order of the Rack. And Melvin, our GM. A bit of context and background. When last I left off with this on the game, Karl had once again tried to get my investigator killed, this time by making false accusations in-game, then using that as evidence to get the torture-loving Hell Knight to then kill me. This ended with Melvin telling off Karl, and having to teach them how to play lawful good before their current session. Speaking of said session, before coming to the session, Tim wrote saying that they wouldn't be available as university and work got in the way. But since it was the big attack on the shaman's camp, Melvin asked if it was okay if his character died. Tim, as far as I'm aware, said yes to this, which should have been a sign of what was to come, although I figured it would be more of as a result of battle rather than what actually happened. At the time, here's what we knew. We had cleared out all the smaller camps, leaving only the big one left. This remaining camp, being the largest, had the most forces, including the shaman and its demons. The camp was stationed outside the city that we had explored and deemed to be the place where we would set up as our kingdom's capital. After infiltrating and spying around, we then got a clearer image of what we were actually going to be dealing with. The shaman camp had roughly over 3,000 in number. This included the demons, of which there were several that could fly, stone giants that were both stationed on towers and threw boulders, and also frontline fighters, half giants that made up the archers with bows equal to their size, ogres decked out in plate armor and rocking magic weapons, as well as various other gnolls and demons. Alongside the shaman, there were two other leaders, a demon-blooded ogre and a half-giant with a tower shield and magical plate armor. And all the demons were stationed at the back with the giants and gnolls situated at the front. Considering all of this, we got some forces of our own, numbering roughly 1,500, only about 100 of which had fighter levels, with only about 10 of those being at most the highest level of 4. Our tactic was mostly to rely upon a quick spearhead, us at the front to clear out the heavy hitters and then work our way into the camp. The odds would be against us, and we knew that there would be casualties, but if we pulled together and handled this carefully, we figured we could do it. A little something else to note. In the last camp we attacked before the attack on the big one, a few strange insectoid creatures popped up and joined the attack against us. From what we had found out, they were of a similar makeup to the Waspman Tim had played in part 1. And when I say the one Tim played, I meant that all of them were fully chaotic evil, rocking with strange tumors. We figured this was just a result of some random rolls on Melvin's part to try and make things harder, and up the deadly factor. Boy, should we have paid more attention to this. The assault. The battle began rather well for us. We had breached the gate of the enemy camp, avoiding artillery from the half-giants and the boulders of the giants to the best of our abilities. Both Amanda and Sam had taken to the air, Sam casting fireballs like a madman and Amanda doing some monk stuff to the flying demons. I forgot how they were flying as a kitsune, though it might have been down to some magic item they found, or some spell-like ability that they had asked Melvin for. Rick stayed far at the back, being more of a utility mage. He didn't have any damaging spells for backstory reasons, and was the only one of us with the teleport spell. This left the rest of us at the front to deal with the enemies as they came. The highlight of this would have to be the assault on the giants in the towers. Between the two towers, Eric and myself with Tim's cleric assault one tower, climbing up and laying waste to them, while Eugene and Karl ascended and struck at the other, all whilst arrows were flying and the giants were doing their best to keep us off. At one point, a giant grabbed Eugene and used them as a weapon. Turns out, full-plate Hell Knight tanks are pretty damaging against Karl, only to get critted on a smite and knocked down. Karl's familiar, which he had because of the Chosen One, managed to get the killing blow, dealing a grand total of 2 damage. In any case, we had breached the gate, and pushing on through, we made our way towards the first of the 3 bosses, the demon-blooded ogre. Our spirits were high, and everything was going well despite casualties. And then the shoe dropped. The moment most of us died. This next part requires a bit of context that no one but 2 knew about at the time this happened. That said, remember back in part 1 of this story when Tim and Karl wandered off? Tim's Waspman becoming chaotic evil, and Karl sporting the magic sword and amulet that got my investigator killed? And then in part 2, where the gnome left and Karl came in with the paladin. Well, it turns out that Melvin and Karl were having one-on-one sessions in the background about what the gnome was doing. This revelation to us after the fact wasn't surprising, as it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. Nor was it surprising that this ended in something bad. However, every other time this happened, no one died because of it, and we were able to contain the situation somehow. This time, it didn't go that way. I vaguely remember the details of how, and was only told so much, but effectively because of both what Tim and Karl had done, the queen that birthed Tim's wasp man, and all other wasp men bred by that queen, had also gone chaotic evil, and had gotten full of tumours. Furthermore, when the gnome left, they ended up meeting said wasp men hive queen, and then absorbed the gnome into itself. Before that happened, the sword Karl had apparently told him to ditch the amulet, which had been fused into him somehow, to which he ignored. The gnome didn't just get fused into the queen, however. No, he got fused into the queen's head, thus giving the hive queen a power boost and giving the gnome some control over what it does next. And guess what the gnome wants to do? So... midway through the battle, the ground suddenly trembles, as burrowing from underground comes the Hive Queen, in all her colossally sized horror. A buzzing in the air then alerts us to the thousands of wasps flying towards us from the east, but that is the least of our worries. For you see, we all see upon the head of the Hive Queen, Karl's gnome, and the amulet he was wearing now glowing brightly. Karl is gleaming like a madman at this point out of game, as all I can do is pinch the bridge of my nose and say aloud, "Oh, for Pete's sake, can we just go one of these games without this sort of thing happening?" To which both Melvin and Karl say in unison, "No." And that's when Melvin says this. The Hive Queen appears before your wall. A wave of psionic energy surges outward in a 300-foot radius. All of you are now paralyzed and prone, and you don't get a save for this. So apparently psionics were a thing in this game, and the Hive Queen had it in droves. Worst thing about this, however, was for Amanda and Sam. Both of them were flying in the air, and since you had to not be paralyzed in order to fly, both of them immediately fall from 100 feet in the air and die instantaneously. No save, no nothing, just dead. And then came the real BS of the situation. Melvin stated that we would be able to move in about 3 rounds, but during those rounds the Hive Queen would be psionically blasting us, as well as hitting us with melee attacks, going twice in the initiative order as well. We did get the opportunity to have a save for this, but there was a catch. It was a dice check 40 will save. No one at level 7 could roll a 40 on a will save. A high level cleric, or a druid with a metric boatload of magic items boosting their saves, sure. Any of us at that moment? Not a chance in heck. Effectively, we had to roll a natural 20 3 times in a row to avoid the damage and thus death. I managed to get lucky on the first roll with a natural 20, avoiding the damage for that round. The next round, however, I wasn't so lucky. Health-wise, I was doing pretty good, having the chance to heal a few times. I wasn't at full, but close enough. 2 failed saves later, however, I was exactly 1 hit point away from dying. Rick was the only character out of the party to avoid the psionic stuff, being more than 300 feet away and teleporting out of this whole mess as the Waspmen hordes were coming. The rest of us were lambs to the slaughter. Luckily, Eric had added enough health to survive the psionic onslaught. He pumped his constitution from the start and rolled pretty high on his health rolls. He managed to get my dying investigator out of there, using lay on hands to get me up enough to start running with him. Behind us, the Waspmen descended and tore everything apart that moved, leaving nothing but a bloody trail in their wake. And thus we dashed like mad towards our only safe haven, the city. We got in there with what remained of our small army and the remains of the shaman's forces, an odd assortment of gnolls, ogres, trolls, and other smaller beasts. For reasons that I wouldn't find out about until after the game ended, the Wasp Men and the Hive Queen were unable to enter the city. That said, they camped around it, preventing us from leaving, and to make matters worse, the amulet the Hive Queen now had gave them the power to prevent the gods themselves from doing anything. Thus, there we were, our comrades dead, our forces more or less destroyed, and nothing we could do to stop this whatsoever. The aftermath and how the game ended. We had about 2 sessions after that, the dead coming back as new characters and Rick becoming the spokesperson for a new world god because of them summoning angels to help with the whole Hive Queen situation. And then the pandemic hit, effectively spelling the end of the game, amongst other things. A few months later, Melvin spilled the beans on what would have actually happened if the game had gone on. And boy, did we dodge a big bullet. Effectively, if we had managed to deal with the Hive Queen, we had a terrible plan for that involving bags of holding, boulders, and flying 400 feet in the air above it. We'd have set up our kingdom and ruled it for a time, before the portal connecting us to the old world stopped working. Upon getting to high levels, we'd then be called forth by Dandemir, the guy who was in charge of the whole camp we were set up in, to meet with them in the city's heart to meet the one funding the whole thing. As it turns out, Dandemir is an evil vampire, working for an old god of the undead that Rick would become the prophet of. The portal disappearing would be a sign of their return, and our going to the city's heart was them to tell us that the city we would have spent so long on setting up was now theirs, to which he would have flooded the streets with undead and that we would have a choice to make. To either die, or join him and become a slave. If we had chosen death, the NPC that resurrected my character in part 2 would have then stepped in to provide a distraction for us to maybe escape, ultimately dying in the process. And that's how the game would have ended, either with our characters on the run and all our time and effort having gone to waste, or indentured into servitude to an evil god of the undead. Conclusions and a look back with hindsight. Since this game, I've not played with either Karl or Melvin. When that game ended, I was already in a year-long game with Rick as the GM for that one, and a second game started up under Eric, with Sam as a fellow player. Looking back on the whole thing with hindsight, and at this point a good deal of experience in playing RPGs, I have a good enough grasp of how both Karl and Melvin work, both as players and Melvin as a GM. Melvin is the kind of GM that absolutely likes to have the party conflict. He'll reward those that decide to do things that will cause problems with players and cool mechanics, but will often screw everyone else over in the process. This was particularly bad in the first campaign with them, as it got to a point where he had to offer to do bad things in exchange for a power-up just to keep up with their encounters. Melvin also didn't quite know how to balance combat correctly. Balance is already a tenuous act at best, which isn't helped by them making next to every encounter something akin to a boss battle. Every battle in this campaign was either something way above our pay grade that could easily two-shot us, or was a large-scale battle resembling more of a wargame than an actual RPG. While the wargame parts were fun to me at least, they didn't allow much for class features to shine, given that most of them were oriented towards single targets. Although it didn't show up much in this particular game, in other games of theirs I was in, he had a habit of railroading the plot, making use of the NPCs, would flip-flop on PvP, and of course, those times things got weird. And the less said about the weird, the better. Karl, on the other hand, was the kind of player that would actively seek out big red buttons, then continually press them until either the button was smashed or the world exploded. Combine that with a GM that rewards people for going out of their way for causing trouble, and those two made for an interesting pair. Suffice to say, at this point, my tolerance to antics and willingness to let things go has been tempered. I do believe in talking things out to reach the root of a problem and try fixing it, but if you try to go out of your way to do bad things to gain enjoyment at the expense of others, I'm not putting up with that. And nor should you. I hope that throughout this, you've learned something of value, and that you don't make the same mistakes that I had made. Such is life. In summary, the Gnome's player's actions kill more than half of the party, and the GM's game ends with all of the player's accomplishments being for nothing. And that's the end of the saga. So, I am formally retracting any brownie points I had given the DM Melvin for talking to Karl about the definition of lawful good. I think one of the most egregious aspects to how Melvin runs the game is rewarding players for actively screwing over the other players by any means, even to the detriment of the entire campaign. We have a not-so-great explanation for Karl's motivation to betray his fellow party members, and incidentally having the important quest NPC the players innately trust being possibly retconned into being a villain. In competent hands, having a trustworthy NPC gloriously betray the party further down the line can be an excellent plot device. Having players perform insight checks to determine if the NPC is being 100% truthful, or maybe giving a particular player a hunch through the use of a player conspiracy, are two methods I can think of for making this work more effectively. Otherwise, you run the risk of having a wahaha villain instead of one that makes the party go, ooh. Other problems with Melvin's style of DMing was requiring these power trips from problem players to keep up with encounters. It not only encourages problems to continue virtually unopposed, but also could demotivate players from being invested in the setting and world. Having designed difficulty can make play more engaging for certain types of players, but be aware that you should discuss this with your players if you intend to run such a hard campaign. And with the power of hindsight's 50-50 vision, this appears to be a recurring theme with regards to how Melvin was running the game. Hard difficulty bordering on principles of unfair, conferring game-breaking advantages for creating party conflict intentionally, and blatant favoritism over a number of campaigns. These communicate to me that maybe Melvin should have been doing purely one-on-one sessions with Karl instead of for an entire group. I do think it's entirely possible, however, that Karl's style of play could have been as a result of Melvin's style of DMing, although there were plenty of opportunities for Karl to discuss why he was playing in such an antagonistic way with his fellow players. If you have to derive joy from play by acting in a combative way towards your fellow party members, metagaming, and min-maxing your character's stats at a table that seems to be primarily oriented towards a roleplay heavy campaign with a group of invested players, that campaign might not be for you, and you might be happier simply having one-on-one campaigns with the DM giving you your intended power fantasy. Because at least then, you aren't making other players at the table feel like pawns on a chessboard. And these are some of the lessons that I have learned from sharing this story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and wish to see more content like this in the future, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It's free to do, and you can always change your mind. And if you have any thoughts on the story or feedback on how I can improve, feel free to leave a comment. And once again, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you all next time. What's that noise? I am not paying for the projector falling off of the ceiling. I don't think I should support what I would consider to be a violation of occupational safety and health regulations. Surely the Institute abides by those? Hello?